Be here with all of you tonight. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. We are having yet another one of our late night conversations. Should be a lot of fun. So glad that you're all here with us. The way we do things here, for those of you who may not be familiar, is I give my opening remarks, what it is I'm going to talk about for tonight, what's on my mind, current events, history, whatever we want to talk about for the evening. Then after that, we do the roll call. And during that roll call, we find out who it is that's on the other side of the camera. Who's on the other side of the camera? Here, I think we can take that off. Right, yeah, lighting's much better without that. After that, we find out who's on the other side of the camera. And then from there, I answer your super chat questions for the rest of the night. So if there is something you would like me to talk about in the second half of our program, by all means, send me a super chat and I will make a point of answering it to the best of my ability. I will give you an answer if you give me a super chat, within reason. Every so often there's something I just can't answer. But for the most part, if you give me an answer, I can give you a super chat. So names and location. Oh, we're not there yet. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. There we go. Just closing the curtain there. I'm thinking we might be able to get a better angle where you can see more of me if I go to the other side. Let's see. I'm using my suitcase as a stand for this. Don't have my tripod with me, don't have my webcam with me. So let's see if I can do it this way. Does this work? No. I was hoping it would work better. Just trying to adjust so I can give you all the best angle possible. No, it looks like I need to do it this way. So, there we go. Is that stable? I'm still at the bottom of the frame. Well, that's the way it goes sometimes, I guess, right? Let's see if we can angle it so I get the red in there. That looks nicer, doesn't it? I was never very good at color, right? Some people are very, very good at color schemes and what colors match and all of that. Not me. I'm not that type, right? I'm certainly moved by visual images, but understanding the way colors interact with each other, what color looks good with what color, that's never been my particular cup of tea, just so you all know. Just a quick announcement before we get going here. If you are in the Portland area and you're a friend of our community, get in touch, be in touch, send me a message. We'll try to plug you in to this weekend workshop that we're doing. We're having, starting Friday night, we're going to have kind of a social, get to know people. Saturday all day and a little bit on Sunday, we are going to have a workshop here in the Portland, Oregon area. So if you are indeed in the Portland, Oregon area, get in touch, right? Direct message me on Twitter or, inbox me or get in touch with local CPI people or figure it out, because we would like as many people to come to this weekend and learn about CPI, learn about what we're up to. It's going to be a great weekend workshop, a great time to get to know members of our community. It's going to be pretty nice. So if you can do that, that would be great. I've just been going over the programs, the programming. Shout out to Christopher. Christopher is a new member of the CPI. He's going to be giving one of the classes. That should be good. Our president, Elizabeth Young, is also going to be giving one of the classes. I'll be giving a few of them myself. And it'll be discussion based. It'll be an opportunity for people to just give discussion, etc. And we're going to have video afterwards. So you'll be able to watch the videos after if you're not able to make it. We have a series of, I can get into all of that later. But I guess I'll start out by saying that as anti-imperialists and people that are opposed to the Western system of monopoly capitalism that is holding back development around the world, and also driving down living standards here in the Western countries. The system that puts profit over people. The system where the means of production, the centers of economic power, function in an irrational way, operating simply to maximize the profits of the private owners, where those of us from the working class sell our labor power to a boss, where profits are in command and production is organized those of us who are opposed to that system are watching a lot of developments that are happening very closely. We are paying close attention to what's going on in Africa right now. Niger asserting its independence from French colonialism and being joined by a number of other countries in West Africa, asserting their economic and political independence. We're paying attention to the ongoing war in Ukraine. As the United States indicates, negotiations may soon be taking place. There may be a de-escalation. We're paying attention to the situation with China. We're paying attention to the situation on the Korean Peninsula. In North Korea, People's Korea, they just had a huge conference. And at this huge conference, it was a conference of mothers promoting motherhood. At that conference, the leader of People's Korea, Kim Jong-un, he broke down crying and he urged Korean women to have more children because he said they need more people to build up their prosperous socialist society. So of course, we're paying close attention to that. We also are watching the satellite that was launched by North Korea, the rocket and satellite activity that's going on the Korean Peninsula. We're paying attention to the Palestinians and the ongoing bombardment they face at the hands of Israel and the crimes that Israel is carrying out, and how the Arab world and the entire world is rallying in opposition to the crimes of Zionism. And we're also paying attention to developments in South and Central America. You've got Nicaragua, where a socialist government, the Sandinistas, is building up the economy, is talking about building a new canal that would counter the Panama Canal, where Venezuela has announced they may go and redraw their borders in order to retake territory that is oil-rich, that was seized by the British Empire, when the British redrew their borders in order to give their territory and take their territory, and how the people of Guyana now live in poverty as Shell Oil gets rich off of their oil resources. So there's a lot of global situations we're paying attention to. We're also closely monitoring the domestic crisis in the United States as divisions within the ruling class intensify. Factions in the ruling class fight against each other in a struggle for power as their system becomes less and less stable. We're doing all of that. And as we do all of that, we know our history, and we know our ideology. And it's with our understanding of economics, and with our understanding of history's challenge and the striving of humanity toward a higher mode of production. It's with our understanding of that we are able to put all of these international events and domestic events, all these global situations into the proper context. And what do we know? We know that human beings are different from every other species that has ever been discovered. Human beings are different in one particular way. Frederick Engels defined it in his essay, The Role of Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man. And Frederick Engels observed that the animal merely uses his environment, and changes the environment only through interactions with it. But man is the only species that forces the environment to serve him, that masters his environment. And it is this difference that is brought about by the process of labor, production. This separates humanity from all other species. Ants have been building their ant farms the same way for millions of years. Beavers have been building their beaver dams the same way for millions of years. Bees have been constructing their beehives the same way for millions of years. But in just 6, 7, 8,000 years, human beings have gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel and iPhones. And human beings are the only species that is constantly reinventing its relationship with nature. It is constantly forcing the environment to serve it in a more efficient way. It is constantly expanding its life expectancy. It is constantly expanding its population. It is constantly expanding the level of comfort, the level of happiness in life. Human beings are like no other species, and that they have this godlike ability, this spark of creativity that defines humanity. We have the ability to be like our Creator, to mimic God and to create and to force our human will on to reality. And that is in itself a unique attribute of humanity. And in the process of constantly striving to build a better life, a longer life, to expand our population, to make life better for human beings, in our struggle to expand and grow, which is the defining aspect of humanity, we constantly reorganize ourselves. And we reorganize ourselves to be more efficient. And we develop social systems that align with the level of production and the mode of production in which we are currently engaged. For the bulk of human history, the overwhelming majority of human existence, we were hunter-gatherers, but we got so good at hunting and gathering. We tracked plant life, became very, very good at predicting when it would be best to gather fruits and nuts. We got so good at hunting animals, developed sticks and rocks and tools and hunting teams, and we coordinated our activities. We got so good at hunting and gathering that there was a scarcity. There weren't enough animals to hunt. Nature by itself was not producing enough fruits and nuts. And it was amid this first ecological crisis, the first climate catastrophe. It wasn't really a climate catastrophe. It was more of a plant life and species catastrophe. It was in the middle of our first ecological crisis that we reinvented our relationship with nature. And we developed agriculture. We started growing our own food. We started domesticating animals. We started planting crops and fields. And that was the first social revolution. Because once we were no longer hunting and gathering, once we were rather producing our own food, we needed a new social system. And out of the hunter-gatherer system emerged the system that we call slavery. And out of slavery eventually emerged the system that we call feudalism. And out of feudalism eventually emerged the system that we call capitalism. And capitalism eventually moved into its highest stage called imperialism. Capitalism in its monopoly phase. And in response to capitalism entering this stage called imperialism, around the world, countries broke free from imperialism and began to develop the very beginnings of the next stage in human development, which is called socialism. Capitalist production is defined by private ownership of the means of production, and the banks and the factories and the industries and the centers of economic power being operated in order to make profit for a small group of owners. However, socialism is defined by rational planning and public ownership of the means of production, a society where the economy is forced to operate in the interests of all society. And the basis for transitioning to socialism is a problem inherent in the capitalist system called overproduction. Capitalism is a system that creates a unique phenomenon. A unique phenomenon that had never happened before. 1825. In the year of 1825, all across Europe, people were starving. Had people starved before? Yep. All across Europe in 1825, people were homeless. Had people been homeless before? Yep. But what made the great economic crisis of 1825 unique was that this was the first time in human history that people had starved, not because there was a food shortage, but because there was too much food. 1825 was the first time in human history that people had become homeless, not because there was a shortage of housing, but rather because too much housing had been produced. The great economic crisis of 1825, that was the first of its kind, and the first of many like it, was an economic crisis unique to the capitalist mode of production. Poverty amid plenty. Poverty created by abundance. People homeless because there is too much housing. People hungry because there is too much food. And 1825 was just the beginning. About 10 years later, there was another similar economic meltdown. About 20 years after that, there was another similar economic meltdown. And people like Henry Saint-Simon, people like Fourier, people like Robert Owen observed these economic crises, these cyclical economic crises, and said that there is something fundamentally wrong with production organized for profit. There's something fundamentally wrong with capitalism. Because people should not be hungry because there's too much food. People should not be homeless because there is too much housing. And that the capitalists were constantly revolutionizing technology. They were getting more efficient. They were using electricity. They were using steam energy. They were burning fossil fuels. They were becoming more efficient. They were getting better and better and better at churning out more and more products. But in the process of doing that, economic crisis continued to come, and it continued to get worse. Greater technological advances that reduced the amount of human labor that was necessary, which should be a good thing, led to greater economic crises. And this all points to the fact that the capitalist system is highly irrational. To illustrate this concept, the great Russian political economist Leontief, he gave the example of the famous coal miner's riddle. The little boy says to his father, "Why is it so cold?" And the father says to the little boy, "Because I can't afford any coal to heat the stove." The little boy says to the father, "Why can you not afford any coal to heat the stove?" The father says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine. Got laid off." And the little boy says to his father, "Why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" The father says, "Because there is too much coal." No system in the world had ever had this problem before, only capitalism. And the more efficient technology became, the deeper the crises became. And it is this understanding, rooted in Marxian economics, that enables us to understand the crisis that is hanging over the world now in our time. What we are facing, the reason that migrants are drowning in the ocean and trying to jump over fences, the reason that the ruling elite of the United States seems desperate to provoke a war with Russia, a war with China, a war with Venezuela or Iran, the reason that the elite and the rich and powerful are fighting among themselves like they've never fought before. January 6th, the storming of the Capitol, Joe Biden throwing Donald Trump in jail to keep him out, the elites, the rich and powerful are battling against each other. The reason that this is happening is because we are in the greatest crisis of overproduction, the greatest crisis of the tendency of the falling rate of profit that has ever broken out in the history of humanity. What the capitalists now can do without workers is unprecedented. They used to have thousands of workers who worked all day long binding books in these factories they called bookbinderies. Now, most book production is print on demand because an entire machine can assemble a book with the press of a button. Short order cooks are a thing of the past. And self-driving cars, which should be a great thing, which would completely eliminate this chore called driving, now hang over the U.S. economy as a curse, as a shoe waiting to drop. They would lead to millions of truck drivers, millions of traffic court employees, millions of Uber drivers, millions of people unemployed, millions of car repair stores. I mean, the results of self-driving cars would be catastrophic, but it shouldn't be. Technology should not result in poverty. It should result in making the life of everyone better, reducing the amount of human labor that is necessary to make life churn should free people up. It should lead to all of us having a more prosperous life. Technology should lead to a better life for all. And the only thing preventing that is the fact that human creativity and human brilliance has expanded to the point that it can no longer fit in to the narrow restrictions of production organized for profit. Human beings' capacity to create and expand and grow and blossom and invent and innovate has expanded to the point that the artificial limits of production organized to make a buck for a boss can't handle it any longer. And the only way out of this looming and highly irrational economic crisis is for the banks and the factories and the industries and the centers of economic power to be organized to serve public good and not the profits of a few. We need a planned economy so that growth can continue unrestrained by the irrationality of the market, the anarchy of production. And around the world, there are a number of countries that have already started doing that. China has been growing my entire life, and my whole life I've been hearing that China is about to fall. China is about to collapse. And it hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet. Why? Why has China been able to continue growing my entire life? Why has China been able to go from being the sick man of Asia to being the second largest economy in the world? Why is it that China doesn't have a market correction as is necessary in the general cycles of the capitalist market? It's because of the fact that profits are not in command. In China, production is organized and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party and by the 5-year economic plans. And there's a big market sector. There's a lot of capitalists making money. But at the end of the day, state central planning dictates and controls what goes on. And back in 2015, when China's stock market tanked, within a week, the Chinese Communist Party had intervened and production had gone right back up again. Right back up again. Because the Chinese Communist Party threatened to arrest anyone caught short selling. It froze the selling of stocks by state-run industries. And with state central planning, within a week, the Chinese stock market was right back up. Because profits are not in command. And that is why China has the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer, Huawei Technologies. And that is why China produces half the steel in the world. And that is why countries across Africa and countries across South America and countries across the Pacific region are aligning with China and doing business with China and hiring China to build railroads, hiring China to build power plants, hiring China to build hospitals and universities and airports, because they see that this growth engine coming out of China is not restricted by the general laws that define the irrational capitalist market. Socialism is about lifting the artificial restraints on human creativity and allowing humanity to surge forward. And Marxism, the ideology that led to the Russian Revolution, led to the Chinese Revolution, the Korean Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, Marxism, the ideology that built labor unions here in the West, the ideology that led to women getting the right to vote, the ideology that led to so many great advances, the civil rights struggle here in the United States and elsewhere. Marxism is a celebration of human creativity. It is a celebration of the fact that human beings are always marching ahead, always innovating, always reinventing their relationship with nature. That's what Marxism is. And it's through understanding Marxism, we can be critical. We don't have to accept every part of it, but it's through understanding Marxism and understanding the breakdown of our capitalist imperialist system here in the West, understanding the rise of countries like China and Venezuela and Cuba and Iran and Russia, understanding this, that we can figure out how to move forward here in our country. We can utilize our understanding of the objective laws of history and apply that understanding to the current situation. And through that, we can develop a strategy for intervening to make sure that life is better for the next generation. That's what we can do. So that is the understanding that we take with us when analyzing world events. And I thought I would just take the first half hour of this stream to lay it all out there for you, to help you understand the basis of our worldview and what holds our community together, why the Center for Political Innovation continues to expand. Folks, CPI, we just had our national convention in Portland, Oregon on Saturday. The biggest convention we've had as of yet, the biggest event we've had as of yet, except for the reception of the Rage Against the War Machine rally. The biggest event we've had. An audience full of people. I keep seeing on the internet people claiming that CPI doesn't exist. CPI is dissolved. CPI is very, very well alive. The people in Chicago and the Midwest region, Milwaukee, Chicago, they're about to have a Midwest meetup. The people in here in Portland are expanding. 7 members just joined since Saturday. We've had 7 new members since Saturday that have joined our organization. We are alive and growing and expanding. And we have some exciting operations that we've planned for the coming year. Because our message, while it seems like common sense to many people throughout the world, in the United States is quite unique. Because Marxism in the United States has become dominated by forces that are not interested in economics. Even though Marxism is pretty much all about economics, they are not interested in economics. Socialism and communism in Western countries is dominated by cultural liberals, people that want to talk about the transgender issue all day long, people that just want to talk about why Republicans are bad people and need to be punched in the face, people who just want to break things and tear things down, people who don't want to build, people who don't want to construct. The voices that speak in the name of Marxism are truly followers of something called postmodernism. And postmodernism teaches that human progress is a myth. Postmodernism teaches that human beings are a cancer on Mother Earth. Postmodernism teaches that right and wrong do not exist, and that there is no ideology or ethical system with which we can understand the world, and that anyone who tries to give you one is somehow a totalitarian dictator that you need to struggle against. Philosophical irrationalism as charted and exposed by George Lukács in his great book, The Destruction of Reason. Philosophical irrationalism, from Friedrich Nietzsche to Ayn Rand to Leo Strauss, the belief that human beings are just another animal, the belief that morality is simply defined by strength, might makes right. That worldview has been taken up by people who claim to speak in the name of socialism, but they don't. They are not. And if you listen to these forces that claim to speak in the name of socialism, they celebrate destruction. They celebrate instability. They celebrate rebellion. They celebrate chaos. They celebrate vengeance. They celebrate the releasing of sexual impulses. And they are not interested in mobilizing society to control the means of production. They have no interest in that. Instead, they are interested in simply carrying out an explosion, simply getting their emotions out. And what we now understand is that these forces promoting degrowth rather than growth, these forces promoting the notion that human beings are a cancer, these forces promoting the notion that you cannot have a thorough understanding of how the world works, and that instead you have to focus on simply deconstructing existing ideological systems. This mobilization of destruction and degrowth and pessimism is not a revolutionary working class movement at all. It is coming from the ultra-rich. This is the monopolists, the richest and the most powerful forces in the world, pushing forward their agenda. They wish to beat society down, to stabilize it amid an economic crisis. This is their method for solving the economic crisis. The idea of moving towards socialism is something they cannot consider. The idea of rationally planning the economy is something they cannot consider. What they can consider is using state power to forcibly degrow, to grind everyone into a lower level of poverty, to reduce the population, to reduce consumption. And thank you, Funky. And by the way, I have 3 super chats that have already come in. I'm going to answer all of them. And thank you. Thank you very much, Funky. And I'm really glad to hear that. Scott was amazing this weekend, and I will definitely answer that. If you got something you want me to talk about in the second half of our show, send me a super chat like Funky just did. But I'm just kind of laying it out there on the table for all of you, helping you all understand what is going on. I'm kind of giving you the overall assessment of our worldview and why we see things, how we see things. I'm giving you all that understanding, the ideology with which the Center for Political Innovation functions, why we continue to expand, why we continue to attract great people. There's a reason. There's a reason. Right? We have something special. We have a worldview that is unique. We have something to offer. And because of that, we continue to expand, we continue to grow, we continue to meet new people, we continue to engage in great projects. And that's our worldview. But what I wanted to talk about tonight was McCarthyism. That's what I actually wanted to talk about tonight. A historical topic. I was looking at my phone today here in Portland. Today I went to Olive Garden in Portland, and I worked on my talks for this weekend, and I listened to some music, and I was looking at my phone, and I think Kim Iverson, who's a YouTube personality, she does good stuff on Palestine. She's had me on before to discuss my books. She had me on to discuss my book, Where is America Going? She had a video about McCarthyism, or about the new McCarthyism. She talked about the FBI and their warrantless spying and gathering of information. And that made me think that it would be good for me to just go over the history of McCarthyism. Because very few people actually know what McCarthyism really was all about. A lot of people's understanding of McCarthyism is that after World War II, in the 1950s, everyone was scared of communists. Communists were the worst thing that you could be, and a lot of Hollywood actors got their lives destroyed because they just read a book about communism or something, and it was bad. The end. That's what most people know about McCarthyism. But there's a lot more to it than that. There's really a lot more to McCarthyism than just that, right? That's a pretty simplistic understanding of what McCarthyism was. So on this stream, for the remainder of my opening remarks tonight, which might go on for quite some time, right? Why not, right? Late night with Caleb, right? For the remainder of my opening remarks tonight, I'm going to talk about McCarthyism. What is McCarthyism? Etc. So the first thing you have to understand about McCarthyism, which no one who goes over the history of McCarthyism ever bothers to explain, is that the Communist Party of the United States was a highly influential organization in the lead up to World War II and during World War II. And they've done everything they can to cover that up. The liberals are not proud of their association with the communists. The conservatives, they say, oh, you'd have to be an idiot to believe in Marxism. Everybody knows. So they've done everything they can to cover up the fact that during World War II in the United States, and in the lead up to World War II, 1936, 1937, 1938, 1939, the Communist Party USA was a pretty strong, powerful, and effective group that had a lot of influence in a lot of circles in the United States. And they don't want you to know that, and they cover that up. But if you don't understand that, McCarthyism doesn't make any sense, right? It's like, why is everyone getting all worried about communists and communist influence? Why is everyone all worried about that? Well, people are worried about it because the Communist Party of the United States had a lot of influence. The communists led the 1937 sit-down strike wave. 1937, all over the country, workers occupied their factories, demanding the right to union recognition. Workers who wanted to have a union recognize them, union recognition on the job, occupied their factories. Thousands and thousands of workers they occupied their workplace, demanding union representation. Most famous of which was the Flint sit-down strike, but there were sit-down strikes all over the country in 1937. The Communist Party was very influential on Broadway. Lillian Hellman, who was a member of the Communist Party, she wrote an award-winning play. It was the first play to ever talk about lesbian and gay rights. It was called The Children's Hour. It was about two women who ran an orphanage, and then a rumor goes out that they are lesbians, and it destroys their reputations. It's a very famous, very, very famous play, The Children's Hour. Charlie Chaplin was a good friend of the Communist Party. He was a Hollywood actor. The Communist Party ran the labor unions. They ran the United Auto Workers. They ran the International Longshore Warehouse Union, the ILWU. They had a lot of influence in the National Maritime Union, the NMU. They had lots of influence within the labor leadership. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL was pretty conservative. So John L. Lewis, the leader of the Miners Union, he punched one of the leaders of the AFL in the face and walked out, and he started the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And with the CIO had no ban on communists, and it hired from the Communist Party almost exclusively. Thousands of communists were hired to be organizers for the CIO, and they organized workers to occupy their factories. And the Communist Party supported Roosevelt, and Roosevelt passed a lot of popular reforms. He created Social Security and unemployment insurance. Roosevelt, he also passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, created the 8-hour workday, created a minimum wage. Roosevelt passed all kinds of laws to protect workers, to protect working families. He hired millions of workers into the Works Progress Administration. There was mass unemployment during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Roosevelt hired millions of workers. And the Communist Party had the understanding that Roosevelt was their ally. Their strategy was to build a popular front against fascism, because there were many factory owners like Henry Ford like J.P. Morgan, that wanted the United States to be like Italy or Germany and become a fascist military dictatorship. But Roosevelt was aligned with a different faction of the ruling class. He was aligned with the Rockefellers, the oil monopolies, and they didn't want fascism. They were aligned with the British. They saw the Germans as a competitor. And so, because of that, the Communist Party and Roosevelt had an alliance. And many members of the Roosevelt administration became friendly to the Soviet Union and friendly to the Communist Party. Alger Hiss was a founder of the United Nations. He was not a member of the Communist Party, but during McCarthyism, they went all out to destroy him, to destroy his reputation, to destroy him because he said so many positive things about the Soviet Union, because he was friendly with so many people in the Communist Party. The Alger Hiss case was one of the biggest cases in McCarthyism. Henry Wallace was the vice president of the United States, the vice president during World War II. And Henry Wallace was an admirer of Stalin. He was a former member, I believe, of the Socialist Party. He created food stamps with the Department of Agriculture before being moved up to be vice president. And Henry Wallace was very much an admirer of the Soviet Union and of Stalin and a friend of the Communist Party, etc. So within the Roosevelt administration, there were many people who saw the Soviet Union as a great ally against the Nazis, who were big admirers of the Communist Party and its organizing of labor unions and its organizing of protests for civil rights for African Americans, its organizing of all kinds of people to do great things and to protect workers on the job, and to its influence in Hollywood, and that the Communist Party was a respected organization. It was part of the Roosevelt coalition. However, after World War II, after Roosevelt died, Truman became president, dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war ended. After that, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union came to an end. Winston Churchill, who'd been the leader of the British government during World War II, he gave his Iron Curtain speech. An iron curtain has descended upon Europe. And the Cold War began. And it was a problem for the ruling class that there were so many people within the American government who had been friends of the Communist Party, who had been admirers of Joseph Stalin, had been admirers of what the Soviet Union achieved. That was a problem for the ruling class, because now they decided the Soviet Union was their enemy. The Soviet Union had been helpful in defeating the Nazis, but now American banks and American corporations wanted to keep their grip on Latin America. They wanted to keep their grip on Asia. They wanted to keep their grip on Africa. Because of that, the Soviet Union, that was leading people around the world to fight for national liberation, the Soviet Union that had enabled China to break free and build itself up, the Soviet Union that was backing all kinds of African liberation struggles, backing the African National Congress to fight against apartheid. The Soviet Union was a threat to the power of American banks and corporations. And the fact that Roosevelt, who had previously been president, had been so friendly with Stalin. The fact that so many within the Democratic Party and within the Roosevelt administration had been friendly to the Soviet Union, friendly to the Communist Party. They had to clean out their house. They had to have a purge. And that was the beginning of McCarthyism. You could really say that, in a way, McCarthyism started before World War II even ended. Roosevelt was forced to drop Henry Wallace from being his vice president and replace Henry Wallace with Harry Truman. And Harry Truman was a conservative. Had been a former member of the Ku Klux Klan. Before World War II, he had said that the USA should see who's winning in World War II. And if the Soviet Union is winning, they should back the Nazis. If the Nazis are winning, they should back the Soviets, so that America can triumph over both. Harry Truman was a very conservative Democrat, a Dixiecrat, a Jim Crow segregation advocate, and he had been a critic of Roosevelt, not a friend of organized labor. But the ruling class of the United States was determined to make sure that Henry Wallace could not become president. If Roosevelt died, they were not going to have Henry Wallace, a friend and admirer of the Soviet Union, they weren't going to have him be president. Truman was president at the end of the Second World War. And as the Cold War got going, the Democrats began purging their own ranks. And a big part of the purge came from the Roman Catholic Church. And this is interesting because later the Roman Catholic Church became quite critical of U.S. foreign policy. During the Vietnam War, there were many Catholic priests who were opposed to the war and got arrested protesting it. In the 1980s, the Catholic Church was very key in protests for Nicaragua and against U.S. weapons going to Central America. But in the 1950s, coming out of World War II, the Roman Catholic Church was in an anti-communist frenzy. And the communist governments of the world were busy exposing the connections between the Catholic Church, the Vatican, and the Nazis, the complicity of the Catholic Church in the Holocaust, etc. The Catholic Church mobilized its members around the United States to be against the Communist Party, to be against the Soviet Union. And they had Catholic trade union associations. And you have to remember at this time, the Republican Party in the United States is largely the party of the rural areas, small farmers. That's the Republican Party began as the party of Abraham Lincoln and the free soilers, the farmers who were not plantation owners. They didn't believe in slavery. The new states that came into the Union, Illinois, Kansas, etc. The Republican Party was the party of the small farmers. Whereas the Democratic Party in the United States has largely been the party of the urban political machines. New York City, I believe, is where the Republican Party or the Democrat Party was founded. Thomas Jefferson, Philadelphia, Boston. The Democratic Party is the party of the urban machines. It's the party of urban, powerful cities in America. And at this time, the Democratic Party was also the party of the South, because the Republican Party was considered the party of Lincoln, the party that had abolished slavery. The South, where you still had Jim Crow segregation in effect, was Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party is the party of the urban political machines and the Jim Crow South, whereas the Republican Party is the party of small farmers and rural people. Less populated states, people that live in rural areas. That's the Republican Party. Well, the urban political machines in the United States, New York City, they call it Tammany Hall, right? In Chicago, it was this machine of Mayor Daley, the Daley machine in Chicago. Philadelphia, they had the Rizzo machine after Rizzo. The urban political machines of the United States were notoriously Roman Catholic because there was a wave of immigration to this country from Ireland, and the Irish tend to be Catholics. There was a wave of immigration to this country from Italy, and Italians tend to be Catholics. There was a wave of immigration to this country from Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europeans who aren't Orthodox or Jewish tend to be Catholic, right? And that the Roman Catholic Church had a huge amount of power in the urban political machines. One of the key leaders of the Democratic Party in New York City was a guy named Al Smith. And Al Smith had run for president in the 1920s and had lost because he was Catholic. And they had made such a big deal out of the fact that he was Catholic. They played up the idea that Catholics were foreigners, they were un-American, etc. And Al Smith, this very prominent leader of the Democratic Party machine, was unable to win the presidency. And during the 1930s, Al Smith became a leader of Democrats who opposed Roosevelt. Al Smith, as a Catholic, a staunch anti-communist, had started the American Liberty League, which was a group of Democrats who broke with Roosevelt. And they said, America can have only one capital, either Washington or Moscow. They accused Roosevelt of being a communist. They had sympathies with various fascist governments like Mussolini and the Nazis in Germany. There had been the Catholic clergyman, very famous Catholic clergyman, His name was Father Charles Coughlin, who'd given radio broadcasts supporting Hitler, and that there was a layer of the urban political machines that had opposed Roosevelt. And this largely Roman Catholic layer of the urban political machines that opposed Roosevelt was mobilized to purge the Democratic Party of communists and communist sympathizers and people from the Roosevelt administration who had been friendly to the Communist Party. In addition to that, the Catholic trade union associations were formed. And these Catholic trade union associations, these were workers. They worked in steel mills. They worked in garment factories. They worked in textile plants. They worked in automobile manufacturing. And it was for working class people that were in labor unions but were Roman Catholic. And the Catholic trade union associations were formed to purge communists from the labor unions, to help drive the communists out of labor unions. And so the Roman Catholic Church and the urban political machines mobilized the Democratic Party to drive out communists and communist sympathizers and people from the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party who wanted to work with communists. And there's many examples of this. Henry Wallace, who had been the editor of New Republic, who had been the former vice president, he broke with the Democratic Party, and he ran as the Progressive Party, right? That was the name of his party, was the Progressive Party, and he ran against Harry Truman in the 1948 election. Alger Hiss was accused of being a communist, this founder of the United Nations, went to prison ultimately for perjury. The Taft-Hartley law was passed that banned any communist from working in a labor union. And the major labor unions all banned Communist Party members from being part of them. And the Catholic trade union associations insisted that the labor unions comply with the Taft-Hartley law. They not fight it on constitutional grounds. And that was the beginning of McCarthyism, was the Truman administration teaming up with the urban political machines of the Roman Catholic Church to drive the communists out of the labor unions, to drive the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party out of the Democratic Party. And to many, it looked almost like an ethnic fight, because many communists, certainly not all, but many, were of Jewish heritage. And the Catholic Church had a history of anti-Semitism. And to many, this looked like an ethnic fight between Jews and Catholics, where the labor leaders and Democratic Party members that were friendly to Roosevelt and friendly to the Communist Party were being driven out, and the Catholic Church was a mobilizing force. And that was the first stage of McCarthyism. And Democrats were largely the ones doing it. In fact, Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy, was heavily involved. They had the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he was heavily involved in it. The Kennedy family later went on to be known as liberals, but Papa Kennedy was involved in McCarthyism because he was a Boston Democrat. He was part of the urban political machine of the Democrats, and that everywhere, all throughout U.S. society, people were watching this new invention called TV, television, and they were getting psyched up about the horrors of communism. They were terrified of communism. Communism was this scary thing. The Soviets were going to come and drop bombs on them and kill them all. Everyone was afraid of the Soviet Union. Everyone was afraid of communism. And so communists were being driven out of public life. Eventually, in 1948, the National Board of the Communist Party were arrested under the Smith Act. And they were sent to federal prison simply for being members of the Communist Party. And at their trial, they proved that at no point had they ever done what they were accused of doing. They had never taught the necessity of the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. They had always preached a peaceful transition to socialism. But it didn't matter, because the way the law was written, it said not only that was it illegal to teach the necessity of the violent overthrow of the U.S. government, the law also said that it was illegal to teach any ideology that might lead one to that conclusion. And the reason that Gus Hall and Henry Winston and so many leaders of the Communist Party were thrown in prison. What they were thrown in prison for were largely things that Karl Marx said before they were born, largely things that Vladimir Lenin had said, right? They were thrown in prison for quotes from books by Lenin, quotes from books by Marx. And that was the beginning. But then we know what happened. That was 1948. The Communist Party's leaders were thrown in prison. It became, in effect, illegal to be a member of the Communist Party. The Communist Party newspaper was banned from the mail. The Communist Party began to almost function as an underground organization. We know what happened next. 1949, you had the Chinese Revolution. And the Chinese Revolution was a dramatic game changer. The largest country in the world, 1/4 of humanity, 1 in 4 human beings, had a communist revolution. Chiang Kai-shek fled to the island of Taiwan, and the People's Republic was victorious on the Chinese mainland. The Soviet Union was 1/5 of the planet that had been communist. After World War II, you'd seen the expansion of socialism into Eastern Europe with the people's democracies. You'd seen the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, established. And then, 1949, you saw the victory of the Chinese Revolution. China was victorious. And because of China's victory, the Republicans suddenly began to say, who lost China? And that was the rallying cry of phase 2 of McCarthyism. Who lost China? And they said that Harry Truman, a Democrat, had been soft on communism. He'd been soft on China. And the Democrats, who had praised Mao during the Second World War, had given guns and weapons to Mao during the Second World War, the Democrats who had defended the agrarian reform policies of China and written books. I mean, there was a best-selling book, Red Star Over China by Edgar Snow, and Roosevelt had met with Edgar Snow, this journalist who'd interviewed Mao at the White House, and that because Roosevelt had seemed somewhat sympathetic to Mao during World War II, because Mao was fighting Japan, because of that, the rallying cry was, who lost China? And the Republicans began to attack the Democrats for being soft on communism. That became the rallying cry. And suddenly the target was not only the Communist Party, was not only the Roosevelt administration and people who'd worked with Roosevelt to be friendly to the Soviet Union. Suddenly the target started to expand. Some very odd things happened during this period. For one, they passed a law that no gay person could work at the U.S. State Department. No gay person. If you're gay, you cannot work at the State Department. Anyone caught being gay was fired from their job at the State Department. Why? Because they argued that communism and homosexuality were somehow together, which made absolutely no sense. In the Soviet Union, homosexuality was illegal. The Communist Party preached that homosexuality was a form of bourgeois decadence. Didn't matter. They passed a law that no gay person could work in the government because homosexuality is sexual deviation and communists don't believe in the Bible or whatever. And they had a huge crackdown on gay people during this period. Meanwhile, they had a huge increase in the censorship of American media and movies, and there was no internet back then. Movies and television were highly censored. They wanted to reduce the amount of sexual content that was in American media, because they thought pornography and sexual content was a communist conspiracy. Laws against pornography, laws restricting what you could show on television, laws regulating what kind of books could be in school libraries where children could see them, were passed like crazy because there was a feeling that communism and sexual liberation were somehow combined, even though the communist governments around the world didn't think that. Even though the communist governments around the world, were quite socially conservative, at least by our standards today, that didn't matter. They associated communism with sexual freedom, with homosexuality, with pornography. And so you saw this big crackdown, this rise of social conservatism in the name of anti-communism. Birth control was considered to be communist. All kinds of socially liberal things were considered to be communist because I guess communists were atheists. I guess that was the association they made, got to be pretty ridiculous. This was like the second stage of McCarthyism. The feeling was that in order to defeat the communists, we had to be the exact opposite of the communists, right? The communists are atheists, so we added to the Pledge of Allegiance. Children in school pledged allegiance. They would say, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." Well, the U.S. Congress decided that wasn't enough. So they added the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. The Pledge of Allegiance was changed to go like this: "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." They had to put "under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance because those communists were a bunch of dirty atheists. And so to make sure that no one thought we were communists and to make sure that everyone knew that being American was against communism, they had "under God" added to the Pledge of Allegiance. What's interesting is that the phrase "one nation under God" comes from the Gettysburg Address of Abraham Lincoln, right? Abraham Lincoln, U.S. president during the Civil War. One of his most famous speeches was the Gettysburg Address. And the speech, towards the very end of it, he uses the phrase, "one nation, under God, indivisible." But if you actually look at the context of the speech, it does not mean the same thing. In the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance, it ends with "one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." If you look at what Abraham Lincoln was saying, in his speech, he was using the phrase "under God" to mean "if God wills it." In Islam, right, in Muslims, they say "inshallah." Right? If they want something to happen, they say, "and if God wills it, something will happen." Inshallah, the Muslim Arabic phrase, means "if God wills it," right? Or as Jenny Lynn is pointing out in the chat, "God willing." You have to remember, at the time, the United States was divided into a civil war. And so Abraham Lincoln is saying we are one nation, indivisible, but he doesn't know because at the time it's divided. And there's a war going on to determine whether or not the country is divisible or not. So he's saying one nation, if God wills it, God willing, indivisible. That's what he's saying. It is not a statement that religious faith is essential to what it means to be an American. That's not what he was saying at all. Right? That is not at all what Abraham Lincoln was saying. Abraham Lincoln, we know, was a religious skeptic. Abraham Lincoln was famous for going into churches and arguing with ministers. And he would read passages of the Bible and debate the ministers. Abraham Lincoln was a religious skeptic. Now, I don't know if he was an atheist. Some people claim he was an atheist. But regardless, when Abraham Lincoln got up in front of the audience and said, "one nation, under God, indivisible," he was not saying that because we are Christian, that's essential to what it means to be an American. That's not what he was saying. He was saying we are one nation and, inshallah, God willing, under God, we won't divide. And that's very clear if you read the speech. So the adding of the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance is based on a complete misreading of Abraham Lincoln's words. It is a complete distortion and misreading of Abraham Lincoln's words by, I believe it was the Knights of Columbus, which was a Roman Catholic, Roman Catholic fraternal organization that worked really hard to lobby Congress to change the words of the Pledge of Allegiance. But it didn't mean what they said it should mean. But regardless, they added "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. There were all kinds of hysterics, and they began investigating Hollywood. They wanted to make sure that Hollywood was not putting out communist messages, sort of dragging film directors and movie stars before Congress and making them name names and turn each other in. It was awful. There was the Rosenberg case, right? There were two people who lived in New York City, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They had worked in the U.S. military. They had been members of the Communist Party, but they'd quit the Communist Party. But they were accused of having supplied the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. Of course, they're not the ones that supplied the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union developed the atomic bomb with their own technology. Right? In fact, when Harry Truman became president and had his first meeting with Stalin, Harry Truman, he learned about the atomic bomb project from Stalin. Right? Stalin had worked with Roosevelt on developing the atomic bomb. Roosevelt had told Stalin he was working on the atomic bomb project. And the atomic bomb was not a secret from the Soviet Union. They knew about it, and they were working on it themselves. And in fact, Roosevelt had the idea to give the Soviet Union the atomic bomb and to give Britain the atomic bomb, to give all the Allied countries to share the atomic bomb with all of them. Now, that didn't happen, obviously. The British were not going to have that. But this idea that the Soviet Union stole the atomic bomb from the United States, that was bullshit. What else happened? We had the Korean War. What was going on? After World War II, the Korean Peninsula had been a colony of Japan, and Japan had been taking Koreans from Korea into Japan and making them work as slave laborers, and it was awful. Well, Korea got its independence. And so the understanding was on the Korean Peninsula that they were going to have elections to determine what government they would have for the entire peninsula. But in the north of Korea, the Soviet Union had liberated and driven out the Japanese invaders. And furthermore, Kim Il-sung, who was the leader of a Japanese resistance army, a group that had been fighting against Japan, he was very popular, and he had set up a government that he created, a provisional government called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Whereas in the South, Syngman Rhee, a leader of the military, he had a lot of support. He had formerly been a Japanese collaborator, but he had a lot of support, and the Americans liked Syngman Rhee. And the idea was that there was supposed to be an election for all of the Korean Peninsula, where everyone could participate, and they would elect a unified government. However, the United States was afraid that communism would spread to the Korean Peninsula. And so Syngman Rhee, with the permission of the United States and the backing of the U.S. military, declared himself the military dictator in the South. And Syngman Rhee became the military dictator in the South. And then the people in South Korea that wanted to have democracy and wanted to be able to vote for the Communist Party were massacred. There was a horrendous massacre at Jeju Island, where they slaughtered thousands and thousands of people, whole villages, just slaughtered this region in South Korea that was known to be a stronghold of communism. And because of that, we don't know who fired the first shot, and it doesn't matter. The people in the northern part of the Korean Peninsula said, we are going to drive Syngman Rhee and the Americans out of the Korean Peninsula. And they started trying to reunify the Korean Peninsula under the leadership of the Korean Workers' Party. So the USA sent its forces to Korea, And there was a really ugly war, a very, very ugly war. And millions of people died. Every building above 1 story tall in the northern half of the Korean Peninsula was bombed. Millions of people, we're talking 3 or 4 million people, were killed. Right? I mean, it has left a horrendous scar on that peninsula. Every person living on that peninsula has a relative or a family member who died in that war. And ultimately, what was the big game changer? Well, the big game changer was China got involved. And China decided they couldn't have the United States killing their comrades in Korea. They had to get involved. And when China got involved in the war, General Douglas MacArthur, a Republican, threatened to drop 5 atomic bombs on China. China did not yet have the atomic bomb themselves. And Douglas MacArthur announced to the Chinese that he was going to drop 5 atomic bombs on them. But he made this threat without asking the president, without asking President Truman. And so President Truman fired him. And he fired him from being the general of the war. However, many Republicans said that Douglas MacArthur was right, and that Harry Truman was a coward for not threatening to drop atomic bombs on China. And when Douglas MacArthur was fired, he was brought back to the United States, and he wasn't fired in disgrace. They gave him a big parade, and the Republicans had Douglas MacArthur speak to a joint session of Congress to give a speech condemning Harry Truman for being a coward and for being soft and not fighting hard enough on the Korean Peninsula. And Douglas MacArthur, even though he was fired for breaking the law and disobeying the commander-in-chief, was made into a hero by the Republicans because he had threatened to drop atomic bombs on China. And this was this second wave of McCarthyism, where it was conservatives attacking Democrats, attacking liberals. Not as the Communist Party, they were already in jail. They were already operating as an underground organization. They'd already been pushed out of the Democratic Party. That wasn't enough. Now the Democrats were the target. Liberals were the target, and Republicans were surging ahead. As the Republicans were surging ahead, among them came a U.S. senator from, I believe, Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy, an Irish American. Joe McCarthy. And he became the superstar of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And he got up and he said, I have a list here in my hand of 51 State Department employees that are communists. Right? And Joe McCarthy, got it, Funky, you're on the list. Joe McCarthy, he had this list he claimed he had of all these people that were members of the Communist Party, that were Communist Party sympathizers. And among the Republicans who were involved in the witch hunting and the accusing Democrats of being communist, Joe McCarthy surged into popularity. He became the center of the anti-communist hysteria in Congress. And what's interesting about Joe McCarthy is that he wasn't from New York. He wasn't from San Francisco. He was from a small town called Appleton, Wisconsin. And he wasn't a rich man. I mean, he was, he did okay. He was a lawyer. He was from a decent family, but he was a small town guy. And what we started to see was that Joe McCarthy was using his anti-communism to go after very powerful people. One of Joe McCarthy's targets was Voice of America. Voice of America was the American government propaganda broadcasts. This was American government propaganda aimed at opposing communism around the world. However, Joe McCarthy thought that Voice of America, in some of the arguments that they made and some of the broadcasts they made, they weren't anti-communist enough. Sometimes they admitted that there was truth in the things that communists said. Sometimes it seemed like Voice of America said things that gave credence to communist arguments. Sometimes Voice of America, did things like try to divide the Chinese communists against the Soviet communists. And even though Voice of America was American government propaganda, it wasn't anti-communist enough. So Joe McCarthy went after Voice of America. What else? 1948, Yugoslavia, under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito, Yugoslavia became the first communist country to cut ties with the Soviet Union. And this was a huge win for the United States. It was a huge, huge win for the United States because of the fact that in the United States, they were trying to fight the Soviet Union. And here you had a communist government led by a communist party cutting ties with the Soviet Union. And so the USA was giving loans and money to Yugoslavia because they were opposing the Soviet Union. They were trying to utilize Yugoslavia as an ally against the Soviet Union. But Joe McCarthy said, no, you're aiding a communist government. You're helping a communist government. You can't do that. And so Joe McCarthy was attacking and going after the figures in the US government that were trying to utilize Yugoslavia and Tito's government as a tool against the Soviet Union. And Joe McCarthy, and this is the third phase of McCarthyism, Joe McCarthy turned to anti-communism and accusing people of being communists and blackmailing people and threatening people as a way to advance his own power. And Joe McCarthy spoke for the lower levels of capital, small business owners, small town lawyers, small town doctors who felt crushed by big capital. Big capital was crushing them, but they also hated labor unions. They also hated socialism and labor unions. They were the petty bourgeoisie, the class that's caught in between big capital on the one hand and the working class on the other. You have the middle class, the petty bourgeoisie. And the middle class was getting crushed. It was getting crushed. It was threatened with losing its individualism. And the petty bourgeoisie became the basis of McCarthyism because they started accusing some of the richest and most powerful people in the world, in the United States in particular, of being communists. The Rockefeller family, conservatives, Republicans. But the Rockefellers, one of the richest families in the United States, longtime oil banking dynasty, they were big supporters of birth control because they were Malthusians. They believed overpopulation was the cause of the world's hunger, and they were big supporters of birth control. And they were funders of Planned Parenthood, the Birth Control League. Well, Joe McCarthy thought birth control was communist. And so Joe McCarthy was accusing the Rockefellers of being communists, right? The Rockefeller family, because they were socially liberal, they believed in sexual freedom, they funded the work of Alfred Kinsey, the Kinsey Report, the famous Kinsey Report on human sexuality. They wanted to investigate human sexuality, figure things out. Well, McCarthy and the McCarthyites thought that, that the Kinsey Report and Alfred Kinsey and his sexual research was a communist conspiracy, indecency. And so you had an uprising of middle-class elements against the leadership of the Republican Party and against conservatism. The conservative camp, just as the Democratic camp had previously been divided between the pro-communist wing that was aligned with Roosevelt, that wanted to work with the communists, and the old political machines, pretty soon the Republican Party, as a result of McCarthyism, was now divided between the fanatical McCarthyite wing and regular conservatives. And the McCarthyists were nuts. And they were ruthless. And there was a member of Congress who committed suicide, killed himself, because Joe McCarthy found out that his son was gay. His son had been at a gay nightclub where the police had raided it, and his son had been caught, and Joe McCarthy threatened this guy. If you don't do what I say, I'll reveal that your son got arrested at this gay nightclub. And because of that, this member of Congress killed himself. because Joe McCarthy was blackmailing it. And Joe McCarthy was notorious for doing this. He would investigate people, and he would find little bits of information on people. And he would go to them and say, now, if you do, I could accuse you of being a communist, and I could destroy your reputation. I could drag you for it before the committee and ask you mean questions and humiliate you. Or you can do what I say, and you can give me what I want. And if you do that, that'll show you're not a communist. He started using his power as the head of the witch hunting, as the head of the House Un-American Activities Committee, to bully people. And that was, Joe McCarthy was using it for his own ends. And he was using it against a lot of very, very powerful people like the Rockefellers, like the U.S. Army. He went after the U.S. Army, said the U.S. Army had, communists within it, Voice of America, people who wanted to do business with Yugoslavia. He was using it for his own ends. And that's when U.S. media turned against Joe McCarthy. And they knew exactly what to do. They started showing his hearings on television. They just started showing them on TV. And people watched Joe McCarthy and how mean he was. There was an old black woman who worked for the federal government. She worked for some government department. She was a secretary. She had a low-level position. Older black lady. And she was sitting there, and he's browbeating her and calling her nasty names. And America saw that. And, to America's credit, there was a lot of racism, obviously, at the time. Jim Crow was still in effect. But the American audiences saw Joe McCarthy yelling at this old black woman. This old black woman who was a secretary, and they were like, this guy is being mean. Why is he doing this? He's asking her, did you subscribe to the Daily Worker? And she says, no, that's just somebody who has the same name as me. I never lived in that state, right? He's got the name of somebody who subscribed to the Daily Worker who has the same name, and he's yelling at her, and she says, no, I never subscribed to the Daily Worker. I'm not, and he's just dragging her through the mud, right? Edward R. Murrow, who's a big late-night TV host, he starts doing hit pieces on McCarthy and just exposing how cruel he's being and how ruthless he's using his power. And then, they reveal, and I believe it was the head of the newspaper, the major newspaper in Las Vegas, Hank Greenspun, who we now know was an Israeli agent. This is all very interesting. Hank Greenspun. Google Hank Greenspun. Hank Greenspun, who was a big, wealthy property owner in Las Vegas, and who was later convicted for stealing millions and millions of dollars from the U.S. Army, millions and millions of dollars worth of military equipment, and giving it to Israel, right? He would just steal. He was a gangster. It was organized crime, and he would steal all kinds of military equipment, guns and tanks and weapons, and give them to Israel. Hank Greenspun revealed in the newspaper of Las Vegas that Joe McCarthy was gay. Joe McCarthy, he reported, was known to go to gay nightclubs. That Joe McCarthy, his lawyer was Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn was gay, right? Roy Cohn was a New York City lawyer who Joe McCarthy had hired, who was also gay, and the two of them were probably homosexual and had an affair with each other. In addition to that, apparently when Joe McCarthy was in the U.S. Army, he had sexually molested young men. He was in the bathroom. He would lurk in the bathrooms when other men would go into the bathrooms, and he would do, inappropriate things in the bathrooms with men that were of younger rank than him, so they wouldn't say anything because they were afraid of getting in trouble. But Joe McCarthy was generally not a nice guy. And he had homosexual proclivities himself. So this came out. It became national news that Joe McCarthy was gay. So Joe McCarthy, the next day, went out and married his secretary. His secretary, he forced her to marry him. They went to City Hall and he had a big press conference. Look, I'm not gay. My secretary married me. And, many people were not convinced. Many people were not convinced. That people found that one a little bit hard to believe, right? You're accused in the national news of being gay, so you marry your secretary the very next day, and he had his secretary marry him. Um, you know, um, you know, that's what happened with Joe McCarthy. Um, and Joe McCarthy was increasingly becoming less and less popular. And we also know about the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs were given the death penalty. Right? This couple, this man and woman who had been members of the Communist Party, had quit the Communist Party, had been in the U.S. Armed Forces. It was alleged that they were spying for the Soviets. Well, they were convicted for conspiracy to commit espionage, and they were given the death penalty. Now, what's interesting was they bent the law in order to give them the death penalty. In the United States, you can get the death penalty for espionage or for treason, but you can't get the death penalty for conspiracy to commit espionage. You can't get the death penalty for conspiracy to commit treason. But somehow they bent the law so they could execute the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs got the death penalty. It was a horrendous case. But the whole world had been saying to the United States, don't execute the Rosenbergs. Right? They're not the ones that gave the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. They're not responsible for that. Everyone in the world, outside mainstream US media, insisted they had been the ones that gave the atomic bomb to the Soviets. But in France and in Germany and in Britain and everywhere else, people looked at it and they said, no, the facts are the Soviet Union got the bomb on their own, that they had been working on it at the same time America had been working on it. They hadn't been that far behind the United States in getting on it. No, they didn't give this. This is ridiculous. The Pope spoke up in support of the Rosenbergs and opposed their execution. All over the world, people were saying, don't execute the Rosenbergs. But they did it anyway. And the Rosenbergs got the death penalty. And Stalin died. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, he was an old man. He died. Now, there are some people who think there's more to it than that, but he was pretty old at the time, right? Joe Stalin died. And at the time of Joe Stalin's death, it was pretty clear that in the aftermath of Stalin, there was a division within the Soviet Communist Party. Khrushchev and his faction wanted to de-escalate the Cold War and negotiate with the United States, whereas Molotov and his faction wanted to continue what Stalin had doing, continued spreading the world revolution. The United States was really hoping they could negotiate with Khrushchev, that Khrushchev could become the new leader of the Soviet Union and they could negotiate with him. But Joe McCarthy, of course, would never have allowed them to do that. Right? Joe McCarthy was totally opposed. So after the United States had been widely condemned by the whole world for executing the Rosenbergs, and after the death of Joseph Stalin, Stalin died and the USA is hoping they can negotiate with the new leaders of the Soviet Union. In this context, Joe McCarthy completely fell out of favor in the United States. And mainstream media revealed that he was gay, revealed that he had sexually assaulted men in bathrooms when he was in the Army, revealed that he was blackmailing people, that he'd caused a U.S. senator to commit suicide by blackmailing him, revealed all kinds of things about him. And in fact, one of the things they revealed is that Joe McCarthy had lied about his military record. Joe McCarthy had never flown an airplane, right? He had been in the U.S. Army Air Corps, but he worked in an office. He had never flown an airplane. But when he had run for Congress, he'd made up this whole story about how he was Tail Gunner Joe. And he'd made up this whole story about he was a heroic fighter, and and it was all made up. It was not Tail Gunner Joe. And he'd lied about his military record also. So Joe McCarthy, he'd gone too far. And because Joe McCarthy had gone too far, because he'd become a threat to the American capitalist power structure, and because his activities were hindering the aspirations of American imperialism, Joe McCarthy, at that point, he was done. He was done. And he ended up drinking himself to death. He died of alcohol poisoning. He went to a bar one night and he started drinking until he died. It was basically suicide by alcohol. He drank himself to death. And the death of Joe McCarthy, the death of Stalin, and eventually 1956, Khrushchev's secret speech, that was the beginning, that was the end of McCarthyism. That was the de-escalation of the Cold War, and that was the ascendancy of Cold War liberalism in America. TV during these years seemed to focus on liberal ideas. The shows like The Twilight Zone, right? Movies like The Manchurian Candidate, all seem to focus on the idea that extreme anti-communism hurt the ability of the United States to fight communists, that the way to defeat communists was by emphasizing our American ideals, staying true to our principles of freedom. The civil rights movement started to expand. 1954, you had the Montgomery bus boycott, and suddenly the civil rights movement was being supported, and the northern wing of the Democratic Party, the Kennedy family, and others were supporting Martin Luther King Jr. as the Montgomery bus boycott was happening. And you saw mainstream support for the black freedom struggle for the first time. And you started to gradually see McCarthyism de-escalate and what they call Cold War liberalism become ascendant, right? Eventually we had John F. Kennedy become president. Dwight Eisenhower was the president who largely oversaw the de-escalation of McCarthyism, and he was a Republican. It took a Republican to do it. Now, those who were loyal to Joe McCarthy, and this is particularly fascinating, people who thought Joe McCarthy was right and did nothing wrong formed the John Birch Society. And the John Birch Society was headquartered in Appleton, Wisconsin, where Joe McCarthy was from. And the John Birch Society, they were named after John Birch, who was a Baptist missionary, who was also an American spy, who was executed by Mao and the Chinese communists. And John Birch, they considered him the first casualty of the Cold War. The John Birch Society was an anti-communist organization that thought Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican president, was secretly a communist because his brother was a member of a church that had supported the Spanish Republic against fascism and had signed fascist statements. Because of that, they thought that Dwight Eisenhower was actually a Soviet agent, and that was, part of their belief. I believe it was Jack Welch, who's the guy who copyrighted the flat sucker. If you've ever had a sucker that's flat, it's not round, that's Jack Welch. He invented that. He copyrighted and patented the flat sucker. He was a candy maker, a guy who owned a candy company, a lower level capitalist who owned a candy company. He started the John Birch Society, and they stayed true to Joe McCarthy. And they're an important force. Libertarianism as a movement in the United States can largely trace its roots back to the John Birch Society. I mean, libertarianism is much more complicated than just that. But they were the ones, the John Birch Society, they were the ones that, that pushed, the idea that the USA needed to return to the constitutional republic. We need a pure free market, etc. What's interesting is the John Birch Society, as McCarthyism kind of lost its power, they tried to keep it alive within the Republican Party. They functioned as kind of a secret society among Republicans. They weren't really secret, but they had the secret book that proved that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist, that they many times denied it existed, but it actually existed, right? And it was kind of a hustle, right? It was all about making money. In a lot of ways, right? But it was like, people would join the John Birch Society and they'd say, so when do I get to see the secret book? And they'd say, there's no secret book. And, and after you were around long enough and you paid enough money, they would show you the secret book. They would always deny that this secret book existed, but it was kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like the secret book might really exist. And if you were a member long enough and you dished out enough money, then they would finally show you the secret book that proved that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist. And there's a very famous event where there was a public meeting that happened where a reporter asked one of the leaders of the John Birch Society if the secret book existed. And he said, for the 100th time, I've told you there is no secret book. And she said, yes, there is a secret book. And she held it up in her hand. She said, "It's right here. I have the secret book." And the John Birch Society, it was much like the Ku Klux Klan had been. It was kind of a multi-level marketing scheme. It was about recruiting people, making money. You know, if you pay enough money, you'll eventually get to see the secret book, wink, wink, you know, that kind of thing. That was the John Birch Society. What's interesting is the John Birch Society, their teaching, their founding document is a book called the Blue Book. It's called the Blue Book. That's their founding document. And the Blue Book argues that that there's a fight between the democracy and the republic. That a republic is the American form of government, and it goes back to Plato and his philosophy. But democracy, the concept of democracy, that's vulgar mob rule, and that comes from Aristotle, and that it's a fight between Platonists and Aristotelians. And I think that what's interesting is that Lyndon LaRouche, who was a Marxist, right? He was a Trotskyite Marxist who eventually developed his own theories. I think that if you look at Lyndon LaRouche's teachings and how Lyndon LaRouche kind of emerged in the 1960s, he kind of came to prominence in the mid-70s, I think Lyndon LaRouche oddly merged John Birch Society anti-communism with Trotskyite Marxism and developed his own brand, because LaRouche also taught that he was a Platonist and that his enemies were Aristotelians, and that is largely a John Birch Society formulation, right? And he also associated, you know, the left with mob rule and chaos. You know, I respect Lyndon LaRouche in a lot of ways, but I feel like there absolutely is a Bircher influence on Lyndon LaRouche, and that he very much, he you know, he thought that small business owners, the kind of people who made up the John Birch Society, were an important part of forming his coalition. And so I actually, when I read the Blue Book and when I read Lyndon LaRouche's stuff, I see a heavy Bircher influence. I mean, obviously Marxist influence on Lyndon LaRouche is well documented. Nobody denies that LaRouche had a heavy Marxist influence. He'd been teaching communist classes for years. You know, I mean, and until about the 1980s, he was calling himself a Marxist. But there's also a John Birch Society influence on Lyndon LaRouche. And I think that's particularly fascinating. If you read the book The Prophet's Children, that was written by the Trotskyite leader, what was his name? Cannot remember his name. Tim Woolforth. If you read Tim Woolforth's book, The Prophet's Children, Tim Woolforth emphasizes that while Lyndon LaRouche was a Trotskyist, his belief was that the liberals were the main danger, which I think he was pretty right about at that time. And that you know, that belief that the liberals were the main danger, you know, that kind of, you know, put Lyndon LaRouche and the John Birch Society in a similar trajectory, and that the John Birch Society emphasized a lot of opposition to rock and roll music and opposition to you know, things in art and culture that were not classical. They promoted classical music as opposed to modern television and such. And so the John Birch Society was clearly a big influence on Lyndon LaRouche, which is surprising because LaRouche was a Marxist. But he also thought that the Rockefellers were the main enemy, the British, the Eastern establishment. And that was the main thing. The John Birch Society used to rant against what they called the Eastern establishment, which was the wealthier wing of the Republican Party, the Rockefeller Republicans, or the old money Republicans, who were, you know, more establishment and were not radical, conservative, Bircher anti-communists. And so I think that's fascinating, and that, you know, as somebody who has a lot of respect for Lyndon LaRouche and what he accomplished over the years, despite, you know, disagreements, I think it's interesting to think about how LaRouche was kind of a mishmash. He kind of took elements of the John Birch Society and libertarian worldview and melded them with the communist worldview, and their opposition to the New Left, and developed, you know, his own kind of perspective. And I think that's very, very interesting. I think it's very interesting indeed. The John Birch Society in their Blue Book, they're connected to elements of the further right, right? Because they quote in their document, they quote, what is his name? They quote Oswald Spengler. And Oswald Spengler was the author of The Decline of the West, which was, The Decline of the West was a pre-World War I far-right text that talked about the fall of the Roman Empire and argued that Western civilization was in decline. And what's interesting is that Oswald Spengler was actually anti-capitalist in a lot of his views. He thought that capitalism was detracting from people's loyalty to the nation state and to civilization. Spenglerian thought, which is a school of far-right thinking, argues that capitalism and socialism are two sides of the human spirit. That capitalism is individualism and the desire to make money, and socialism is loyalty to one's community and loyalty to one's tribe and obedience to authority. And that the human beings have both capitalism and socialism within themselves, and that in some periods capitalism is rising, other periods socialism is rising. And that Spenglerian thought is the basis for what many people refer to as Prussian socialism. You had Ernst Juncker. Ernst Juncker was a figure who eventually became associated with what they called Prussian socialism. There's a whole trend of, far-right anti-capitalism that you can trace back to Oswald Spengler. And even though the John Birch Society was very much obsessed with free markets and capitalism, the John Birch Society did have, they clearly had studied more elements of what you might call the esoteric right wing. And this is something I find to be very interesting. I've studied a lot of political history and political movements, and that, that the far right of Europe, right, Marxism and socialism and dialectical materialism defined the far left. And kind of, until today, now things are all confused, but until the end of the Cold War, from the 1800s until the end of the Cold War, Marxism, socialism, dialectical materialism kind of defined the far left. But the far right, many people think the far right is just Christianity, or the far right is just, conservative patriotism. But actually that was the middle of the world. That was the mainstream view. These European countries, Catholicism or Protestantism was the official religion that most people held. Loving your nation, loving your country, that was just standard. But the far right, they tended to have esoteric beliefs, right? Theosophy. Have you ever heard of the religious trend they call theosophy? That was associated with Nazism as a movement. It's kind of a mystical religious trend in Western Europe and in the United States. And theosophy incorporates elements of Eastern religions like Buddhism and stuff and mixes them in. And, theosophy was a big influence on Nazism and in far-right circles. Julius Evola is an Italian intellectual, nobleman who's an expert on Hinduism and Tibetan Buddhism. And, he is considered one of the leading intellectuals of Italian fascism, promoted by the Italian fascist state, Julius Evola. And that esoteric religious movements and elements to bring Eastern mysticism and the philosophies of the East to Europe, belief that we need to go back to the traditional ways, what we refer to as the occult, right? Occultism. Aleister Crowley, he was a big British occultist who claimed to be a British intelligence officer. All of that stuff was associated with the far right. And that Oswald Spengler and theosophy and all of this, that's historically, that's what it means to be a far right-wing person. Nowadays, being far right-wing just means you're ultra-patriotic, ultra-constitutional, ultra anti-communist or whatever. But historically, the far right was where you found esoteric religious trends, Eastern mysticism, occultism. What's weird is during the 1960s, those movements became associated with the left because the hippies were all into that. The hippies were into Eastern philosophy. The Hare Krishna movement became a big part of the anti-war protests against the Vietnam War and pacifism. And so politics has gotten all confused. And since the end of the Second World War, it's really not clear in the United States what it means to be left and right. And that's why with the Center for Political Innovation, I've been urging people to get beyond left and right. Just get beyond it, right? Because at this point, they don't have any meaning. Historically, they did have a meaning. Left was progress. Left was advancing productive forces, creating a more egalitarian society by empowering people, raising living standards, advancing scientific progress. That's not what left means anymore, right? And I'm here in Portland. You think Antifa is all about that? You think that the bike people, and you think that the vegan trend, are they about advancing historical progress? No, they're not, right? And climate change and degrowth and Eastern mysticism, all these things that would have been considered far right before World War II are now considered left. Meanwhile, there's many things that are associated with the left, like populism, supporting the working class, like wanting peace with Russia, like being skeptical of war propaganda against Russia and China and other countries. That's now considered far right, right? If you question what mainstream media says, you're spreading conspiracy theories. You must be a conservative. So left and right don't mean anything anymore at this point. They did mean something at one point. When in the 20th century you had the Communist International and the Soviet Union, left and right did have a clear meaning. Now they don't have any clear meaning. And in this time, I talk about the city building tendency, city builders and vandals. That's what I talk about. And that's generally the basis of the CPI worldview. We call ourselves the city building tendency because you can't, this left and right has lost its meaning. Look, I agree with the libertarians on a lot, not on economics, but on freeing Julian Assange, stopping the police state, stopping the march toward World War III. I agree with them. Whereas there's a lot of people who call themselves socialists and communists that support Joe Biden, have this hysterical belief that Trumpers need to be thrown in prison and that we need to silence dissidents on the internet, and they want degrowth and all of that. And so it's all over the place. It's all over the place, I would argue. That we need to get beyond left and right. We need to focus on building our own trend. And we have no loyalty to the left. We have no loyalty to the right. We have no loyalty to anything other than wanting to make a better life for working people, wanting to make a better society, wanting to have peace with Russia, peace with China, peace with the countries around the world, supporting the new economy that is emerging around the world, this new emerging economy centered around the BRICS countries that's about growth and development and breaking the world free from the dominance of the international bankers and the international monopolies. We're loyal to the new economy. We're pro-growth. We're pro-humanity. We're pro-working class. We're against racism. We're against war. That's what we're loyal to. Those are my thoughts. That's what I wanted to talk with you all about tonight. Gave kind of an opening about what CPI stands for, then talked about McCarthyism, then ended talking about different ways of relating to the political spectrum. This is a good stream. We've almost gone for 2 hours, but now I'm ready to start answering people's super chat questions. But before we do that, let's do the roll call. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. I see Rice from Adelaide, Australia. Welcome, Rice. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati, Mark Jones in Utica, New York, names and locations. Stephen Clearly in Auckland, New Zealand, Nate in Chicago. Very, very good. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I see Panos from Greece, China Shilly from Cali. I see Bob Troy in New York, Patch in Arizona, Anthony in Detroit. I see Jeff from Delaware, Luca from Madison, Wisconsin. I see B from Cleveland. I see Marta Freehold in New Jersey. I see Ellie in Chicago. Shout out to you, Ellie. Great work all those Chicago people are doing. I see Gary Giordano in Oregon. I see India. I see Amway in India. I see Chris in Salt Lake City. I see Joe in New Jersey, home of the revolution. I see Briggy in Pennsylvania. Shout out to you. I see Heidi from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Welcome, Heidi. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations. Chris in Salt Lake City. Wow. Bruce Monroe from the Philippines. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Seasoned noob in China. Killian in Milwaukee. Shout out to you, Killian. Shout out to you. And you should be a mod, Killian. I don't know why you're not a mod yet. I'm going to mod you. I'm going to mod you. I'm going to mod you, Killian. I don't know why you're not a mod, but you should be. Yeah. You are a mod. You've been modded, Killian. Welcome to being a mod. You're a mod. All right. Names and locations. Anybody else? Names and locations. Hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the notifications bell. Always a pleasure to speak with folks. Alex Rickle in Portland. You should be a mod as well. You should be a mod also. Alex Rickle is awesome. I got to spend some time with Alex Rickle the last few days out here in Oregon, and Alex Rickle is a great guy, and that's really, really great. He's probably at work as he's listening to us. He works nights. So there we go. All right. We got St. David's, Bermuda. We got Patrick in Maine. Shout out to you, Patrick, beloved member of our community, Patrick. St. David's, Bermuda is with us. Names and locations. Names and locations. All right. Moonlight Beach, California. Scott S. is with us. Welcome, Scott S. Good to have you. Names and locations. All right, folks. All right. So I'm going to start answering people's super chat questions. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, a super chat, by all means, send it in. I've got 3 so far. Or no, I've got more than 3 so far. I've got what? I've got how many super chats do I have? I've got 4 super chats so far. I've got 4 of them. I am going to start answering them. If you have more super chats, I got 2 here from Tim Baller, I got 2 from Funky Lollipop. If you got more, send them my way, get me talking. Get me talking. If not, this will be a short Q&A session, but keep the questions coming, keep me talking. So first one, did Venezuela violate the sovereignty of Guyana? No, as I explained on my previous stream, those borders were drawn by the British Empire, and the people living in those regions don't benefit from their oil. Shell oil controls the oil of that region of Guyana, and it impoverishes the people there. And Venezuela wants to enable the people of that region to exercise their own sovereignty over their own land. Those borders were drawn by the British Empire. That used to be part of Venezuela, and it's oil rich. And now that oil belongs to a big British Empire corporation, Shell Oil. And it should belong to the people of Venezuela, right? And it should belong to the people who live there, right? So by expanding Venezuela's borders to where they used to be and rolling back what the British Empire did, and by enabling the people to control their own natural resources and benefit from them economically, Venezuela would be in the right, I would argue. I think they would be in the right to intervene, but they haven't done anything yet, right? I mean, they just took a vote on it, they talked about it, they haven't done anything yet, so it hasn't happened yet, okay? So, we'll see how this plays out, right? But ultimately, I mean, they argue that they are in the right to do this, and I think there is a strong historical case for Venezuela to expand into Guyana and enable the people of that region to control their own natural resources, to undo what the British Empire did when it drew the borders of Guyana. There you go. And on top of that, right, I mean, the United States wants to put more military bases there and threaten them. And I mean, the idea of letting the people of that region control their own natural resources and join with Venezuela, I think that would be a great thing. I'm not opposed. All right. The New People's Army negotiating with the Philippine government. Well, I hope that the New People's Army can negotiate peace and that armed conflict can come to an end in the Philippines. If you read Fidel Castro's writings about the FARC and why Cuba stopped supporting the FARC, they pointed out that if you're engaged in an armed struggle for this long, it reduces to criminality, right? That an armed struggle in some cases can be necessary, right, when you have no choice, but the situation in the Philippines is not that, right? And that it's necessary at this point to de-escalate the armed struggle, and the way the Philippine NPA has conducted itself by primarily targeting Chinese businesses and Chinese targets, and it is reprehensible in my view. The NPA has a glorious history of anti-imperialism and fighting for democratic rights under Marcos, etc. But in the last 5-6 years, their legacy has been tarnished by basically becoming an anti-China counter gang for the United States. And I hope that they can negotiate a situation where they end the violence, right? I mean, obviously the Filipino government has committed many atrocities against the people. And obviously, historically, the NPA has done a lot of heroic stuff, right? I mean, you can't discredit them. But at this point, they're just an anti-China fighting force. And they're not going to take power anytime soon. The idea that their protracted armed struggle is going to lead to them taking power, that's not going to happen. So, it's kind of like the FARC. They need to make a deal, and they need to figure out a way that they can end the armed struggle, but be able to be part of society.
Because that's the problem with these armed conflicts, is part of the reason that they just continue is that, if you've been waging war against the government, you can't just go back to living a life. So my hope is that if the Filipino government wants to bring peace to the Philippines, they'll negotiate a way that the islands that are under the control of the NPA can be, incorporated into the government, that the NPA forces, they can have seats in the government, and they can be represented, and they won't be retaliated against. They won't all be rounded up and thrown in prison or something like that, right? That they'll be able, just like with the FARC, right? The FARC negotiated a way that they could end the war and be part of Colombian society. And that is what I would hope could be the case for the Philippines, right? You know, that's what I would hope would be the case. But read what Fidel Castro wrote about the FARC, right? Because the FARC, it started out as a justified armed struggle against a military dictatorship, but over the course of decades, it turned into armed struggle being a way of life, and that deteriorates into criminality. And the same with the Naxals in India, right? The Naxals, I mean, yeah, in the 1970s, they were, trying to form a communist army and all of that. But at this point, the Naxals are just criminals, right? The Naxals, they rob people. They're not going to take power. The biggest industrial working class, the second largest industrial working class in the world, is right there in India. They have nothing to do with them. They assassinate genuine communists all the time. The Naxals are not good. Now, the NPA is not the Naxals, right? They have their problems, and they're playing a horrendous role. They're vicious to China, but they are not. They absolutely are not as bad as the Naxals in China. But it would be very, very good if they could negotiate peace, because I don't think the NPA at this point is playing a very good role at all. I mean, I just don't think they're playing a very good role. Um, you know, um, yeah, I mean, there's not much more to say about it. Yeah, and like I said, if anyone else has anything else they want me to speak about before we end the stream here, I've got two more super chats to address. Funky says Scott Ritter gave CPI a shout out on his show and gave the Portland event high praise. Funky, can you find me the link and send that to me? I will cut it for the CPI YouTube channel. That is very, very, very important. Please find that link for me. Scott is amazing. Scott's speech that he gave, I cannot wait until it is up on YouTube. It was an amazing speech. Amazing speech that he gave. Amazing. Scott is awesome. Scott is just absolutely great, and it was really an honor for him to come out here. And I mean, his health. I mean, it was it wasn't totally easy for him. He's his health made it difficult, but he still came out. And we really really appreciate that. And it wasn't just him. Garland Nixon, Joe T. Brar, Lee Stranahan. Um, oh man, so many amazing people. What we have at CPI is really really unique. And if you come to one of our conferences, you will see how unique and amazing the Center for Political Innovation really is. Scott was amazing, and this has been a successful time. Hey, and it's not over yet. If you're in the Portland area and you want to come to our workshop that's happening this weekend, get in touch. Get in touch. We do have to vet you for security reasons, because we know that Rose City Antifa is on us, right? And we don't want them to pay us a visit and stuff. We had security at the conference, but we want to make sure we're safe. We don't want but at the same time, we want people there. So if you want to come to our Portland workshop, be in touch. Get in touch. We have to vet you first. Some security procedures to make sure you're good. But you'll never be too careful. But overall, we're going to have a successful weekend. We'd love to have you at the weekend workshop we're doing here in Portland. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be really, really great, and I'm looking forward to it. So yeah, and yeah. Did the weirdo get his hit piece out yet? Yeah, I'm waiting for it. Bring it on, buddy. Bring it on. Where's the hit piece? Come on, get on it, buddy. Yeah, but there you go. There you go. And what can we learn from the history of McCarthyism and how to combat modern day McCarthyism? Well, the main thing about McCarthyism was that the reason that it ascended was because the USA at that point had a really high standard of living. Coming out of World War II, the United States had the highest standard of living in the world, and the class struggle message of the Communist Party was no longer of interest to a lot of Americans, because they were suddenly moving into the suburbs and they got their house and their car, and so they didn't want to hear it anymore. A lot of people who had been communists and had been big labor union radicals before became much more moderate. Okay? And that that was a really big factor in McCarthyism, is the Communist Party was very isolated because the US economy was booming. It was booming, and because the US economy was booming, class struggle politics wasn't of interest. And that is not the situation right now. If anything, class struggle politics are at a height of interest. People are struggling economically. The US standard of living is dropping. And in these circumstances, there's no reason for those of us that are anti-imperialist, those of us who believe in class struggle, to be isolated. We shouldn't be isolated. We should have a base among the masses. So, I mean, if you want to protect yourself from McCarthyite-style repression, I think the best thing to do is build a base among the masses. We need to win over the bulk of the population to have our backs, out of the movement to the masses. That's what we need. Out of the movement to the masses, build a base among the masses. Because when you have a base among the masses, it's much harder for them to go after you because you have a layer of people who support you. Right? And then the other thing to remember is that anti-communist repression, that's a constant thing. They were throwing communists in jail in the 30s. They were throwing communists in jail in the 20s. They were throwing communists in jail in the 1910s, the 19 teens, and there's always repression. The question is, how well are we able to push back against it? And in McCarthyism, we weren't able to push back against it because the balance of forces was against our favor. But I would argue the balance of forces now is coming more into our favor because of the economic consequences, because of the rise of Russia and China, because of the divisions in the ruling class. I would argue, but not if we don't do the work, not if we don't build the organization, not if we don't win over allies, not if we don't go out and engage with people and struggle with people, right? And so we have to do the hard work, right? And being on the internet doesn't cut it. You need to be part of a real community. You need to connect with real people. You need to get involved in outreach work, right? You have to win people over out of the movement to the masses, out of the movement to the masses. That would be my response. So, all right, folks. Well, I guess that's it for tonight. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.